What's up, guys? Welcome back to this episode of the Road to Redemption podcast. I have an amazing guest for us today. His name is David Plazas. You might have seen him on News Channel 5 Inside Politics, TEDx Nashville, the Tennesean, and also a site that he created, Civility Tennessee. David, thank you so much for being here with us today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Well, thank you, Cam. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I saw your talk last weekend at TEDx Nashville, and I have to say, now I have to give you amazing kudos because the CEO of TEDx kept giving this away, but most wouldn't know this, especially you're a very talented speaker. You were speaking to a relatively empty auditorium, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
it was
a couple people.
Yeah, maybe a dozen, if that many. And I arrived. It was strange because I hadn't been to an auditorium since the shutdowns, and this was back in September when we filmed it, and everybody's wearing masks and being on campus at Belmont University, and we come in, and going to an empty auditorium. I'm used to moderating a lot of events. I've moderated Senate debates, gubernatorial forums, where you have packed audiences. Everybody's like packed in like sardines. And in this case, obviously, because of COVID, we are having to keep our distance and abide by very strict protocol.
Yeah, it was amazing. And outside of that very small detail, which I just found interesting, because I've given speeches to small crowds and I've given them to semi-larger crowds, but I've never given them to a crowd where it's actually, I just watched Tony Robbins had an event and he's doing everything in a room by himself, but he has 800 screens of people going nuts around him. And I was just interested as to what that would be like. Your story is amazing. Now, you didn't get to tell a lot of it on the TEDx stage, but you do tell it other places. Start us from the beginning, because the story with your parents and your upbringing and everything that I've heard, I would love to just ramble it off for my followers and my supporters because I know they wouldn't want to hear it, but I want them to hear it from you the way you tell it. I heard you give it a couple years back, and I'd love to hear that again.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. I appreciate it. So my dad is from Colombia, South America, grew up in a mountainous area north of Bogota, the capital. So it's an area that has high altitudes, I think a mile up. My mom is from Cuba, and they ended up meeting in Chicago. They had both gone for different reasons. My mom to escape communism there in Cuba, and my dad for educational reasons. He went to go get a degree at Loyola University. And they settled there, and my siblings and I were born and raised in Chicago. My dad was a Catholic priest when he married my mom, or right before he married my mom, I should say, and then he eventually became an Episcopal priest. And so my siblings and I were baptized Episcopalians. So being a preacher's kid means you do a lot of church, and for better, for worse. And it's true, some of the stereotypes about preachers' kids being a little bit mischievous and rambunctious, and but we are very well behaved. We know how to behave very well, and learn to be hospitable. And grew up going to parochial schools and got a scholarship to go to a suburban school, which was an amazing education, but also really interesting because I went to a high school where there were kids there who had very expensive luxury cars driving into school, and I was taking the train from the city with some of the other scholarship kids. But the education was amazing, and it really prepared me for my next steps. And I'll just say, I was going to be a lawyer. Actually, my dad was very much of the mindset, and perhaps is the immigrant mindset, that you're going to pick something that makes some money, either be a lawyer or a doctor, an engineer. And I'm like, lawyer was the closest thing because of the writing aspect. I've loved to write since I was a kid. And eventually a trip abroad to Spain, writing a lot and corresponding with some mentors, changed my life. I decided I can't be a lawyer. It's interesting, but I don't want to be a practicing lawyer. And so I decided to veer toward journalism, and I've been in journalism now for 20 years.
Yeah, it was amazing to watch how you started, because in my preparation for this episode, I went back and watched just years of your content, different public speaking events that you've gone on to, like I said, the different news outlets that you've been on, and you've spoken very in depth about what I take, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but communication in the world, how important it is in our upbringing. And honestly, I say this ad nauseum to my family, but I believe communication is the reason that we're having so many issues today, which is why I love what you're doing in Civility Tennessee, because regardless of political beliefs, what your background is, what you do on a daily basis. I think we should all be able to still come together and have a conversation about the things that we find important, whether we agree on them or not.
I would agree with you. I mean, I think I took for granted a long time in my family having dinner conversations. So being at the dinner table was required, and learning how to talk to each other, even when we had disagreements, and learning how to kind of to calm down and learning to listen and resolve differences. So I was at a very early age was learning conflict resolution, and I never appreciated it. I appreciate it a lot today because the work with Civility Tennessee was a little bit scary. As I mentioned in the TED Talk, the TEDx talk, it was, I was kind of coaxed into it by my boss, but I knew he was right. I knew it was the right thing to do because this polarization is so unhealthy. I saw it destroy friendships. I've seen it destroy communities. And even now, post-election, 2020 election, one of the biggest challenges I have is talking to people about the facts of the integrity of the election. And that's hard for some people who are still convinced that this election was rigged. So this is going to be an ongoing conversation. Yeah.
I was going to touch into that a little bit with you because I ignorantly, for years of my life, I was in the military for 8 years, and of those 8 years, you kind of gain a blind allegiance. I'm confident in saying that I think most people in the military don't honestly think about politics a whole lot. You just don't. I mean, you're not even allowed to, because you're not allowed to give an open opinion when you're in uniform and things like that. So it's just something you don't go wholehearted into. This has been totally different. This has not been the way. I mean, military, non-military, law enforcement, non-law enforcement, everyone cared about this election one way or the other. And they had, it seems this way to me, and maybe you can give me some more insight, that everyone has a emotionally charged opinion about this, about the election as a whole, the candidates. How do we break through? How do we know what's true? Because mail-in ballots, is that good or bad? Can we trust the media that's even putting out the sources telling us about these ballots? I watched something with you where you specifically said the term fake news is dangerous and is an insult to journalists. And I agree with that. Where do you think we start with all this?
Yeah, first, thank you so much for your service. I appreciate it. I have family members who are veterans or who are currently serving in the military, and it's such an honorable endeavor and profession. And I would tell you, it's first by trying to gain a common vocabulary, which is really important, because too oftentimes the reason people have conflict is because they are in completely different headspaces.
Yes.
One person thinks that you should be here, I think you should be here, and then you never resolve anything. And one of the most difficult things about communication is there's a sense of compromise, which has become such a dirty word in recent years. And compromise is not about compromising your values or your integrity. It's about taking a moment to find a win-win for the situation. And I've often spoken about the fact that conversations that are civil are not necessarily arguments that are to be won. They're about having an exchange. Because sometimes there is no winning in the traditional sense of gaining a point. Rather, the win maybe is making a friendship. I'll tell you, I have a friend of mine who agreed to be on my show a few years ago before I had the formal podcast, and we were talking about questions on racism. She is a Black poet and artist, Stephanie Pruitt, and she did a great job and talked a lot about listening. And a few months later, we decided to go get our certify for our concealed weapons license out of kind of a lark, because we said, we have this bias ourselves. If we're truly open to conversations that are outside our comfort zone, we have to try to enter those spaces. And we went to a gun range in Antioch and passed our test. And it was a great experience. We took our spouses. We had a great time.
Even being a service member, I'm one of those people that in the gun control area, I'm probably, I don't know, a unicorn of sense, because I'm a service member that doesn't believe anyone should be able to just walk around with an AR. I think that there are, because I've seen what they can do, So I'm one of those individuals that I love these conversations, which is why I'm so excited again to have you on. Do you think that, I heard something interesting, and it was from Jordan Peterson when I was listening to one of his videos, and a lot of people have said it, but a problem in today is that we speak more to return our thoughts. So when people are speaking, we're thinking of what we're going to say while they're speaking, and we're not listening to them.
Mm-hmm.
We're doing that so much on social media, and we want so badly to break through, whether we're a writer, a content creator, just some random person with a Twitter account. Everyone has this desire to break through the noise and be the one that's being heard. Do you think that this is ultimately just a mass exposure of that?
I think in many ways it is. And I think we are so, as a society, become so used to answering immediately
Yeah.
that we're not answering thoughtfully. And there was a meme that was shared with me by a friend of mine that, it would be very hard to do in the professional world, but it would be an ideal thing where someone gets an email and says, I am going to reflect upon your email for the next 2 days, and then I'm going to take 2 more days to come up with a thoughtful response. And that's not always possible, obviously, but the whole point of it is sometimes we spend too much time reacting as opposed to thinking, is this something I should even respond to? Or is this something that needs to be taken to another level? And I'm like, conversations like these are very exciting to me because I get to see your face, your eyes, I get to hear how you speak, and and it's much more effective than a text or a tweet where you may not know what my tone is. You may think I'm angry when in fact I'm just reacting in the way that I might react.
Well, you have a deeper toned voice, and I've noticed even just in our conversation, while you're an amazing public speaker, and I keep saying that because I'm a public speaker and I know what it takes to do that. When I watch you get up, you take control of a room. Do you find in your personal life sometimes it's hard? Because I find this for myself when I'm talking to people, they feel like I'm talking at them sometimes because I'm used to going, well, this is how I think. And I'm kind of waiting for this response back of, okay, let me have it. Let me have what you think. And if it doesn't come, they're stuck going, well, that was a lot. That's a lot of intensity coming from you when you care about the things you're speaking of. Do you find that at all?
Yeah, I do. And I think I'm much more calm about it because of the Civility Tennessee campaign over the last few years. But I can definitely relate to you 100%. I mean, feeling that, this is the point I have to make. What's the debate? And especially when I was a lot younger, it was kind of like that desire for immediacy and for some immediate gratification. And we can equate it in the social media world to the need for a like or some kind of reaction or some kind of comment. And, I think one of the things that has been very beneficial to me over these last couple of years that has helped me deal with the really the hecticness that we've seen is taking time to just disconnect and disengage. Because, for example, I spoke in the TEDx talk that, a lot of social media platforms aren't productive for conversations that are needed to have.
Yeah.
And oftentimes people lose that sense of inhibition, that they actually go and they react and they're mean. And, we're in this society where people want to cancel each other. I have a joke with one of my younger columnists, younger staffers, who always says to me, please don't cancel me.
Because you're a journalist and they see it as you have the ability at any point to just hit that button and shut it down.
Yeah, and it's not healthy. I mean, I think this is why I prefer that opportunity to have those discussions, because you really can't resolve issues when you're in a point of defensiveness, or when, we always have some hurt that we carry with us and pain that we carry with us. But the question is, what am I going to resolve today? My grandfather was a grocer, and he often used food terms to help us understand the world. And he said, when you eat a sandwich, you don't stuff it down your throat. You eat it one bite at a time. And that's how he dealt with the world. I mean, sometimes things take time. And even one of the things that we as journalists need to do better is create sustained relationships with people, with communities, so that they see us as committed, invested stakeholders, and not just folks who are going to parachute in and leave. And so this fake news stuff, I had spoken in the talk a little bit about the fact that I was invited to a speech in McMinnville, Tennessee, in a rural area of Tennessee. And I was asked, why should we trust you? And I still remember that. I have a picture of that on my desk, and it's a reminder always to take the moment to reflect on it and answer it, and always have that, present in mind, because I've been responding to a lot of emails post-election, and I take the time to respond, even when people are angry, just to say, I thank you first of
Sure.
all, for taking the time to respond and read. And sometimes, sometimes you resolve the issue, and sometimes the resolution is that you just wanted to hear back from somebody who heard them.
100%. Yeah. And that's going to lead exactly into the two big parts that I want to get into next, because on my show, we talk a lot about shattering stigmas and labels. Opening communication lines are going to be the only way that we do that. And one of my biggest things has been, and I connect to your story a lot, has been what makes a real man. And I think if you watch on social media, if you watch these feedback engagements that you get from people that respond to your content, a lot of it is people struggling with their identity, their masculinity, and they feel the need that as a man, I have to say these things, act these ways, have these beliefs. And people don't take the time to, and I see the statue behind you, to meditate or whatever that is for you, to understand, how do I really feel about this? Like, not what is a man based off of what I've seen it my entire life or what I think it is, but what is a real productive man in society? And you've talked about that a little bit and finding out what that is in your own life. Can you share with us a little bit that journey that you've gone through, and what is it today, and how do you use that to stand your ground and go, hey, look, I'm the same amount of a man as you are, and you are as me, and we can have completely different ideas about life. That doesn't make one of us less than the other.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And that journey of masculinity is always a tough one, because
So tough.
it's about trying to find self-worth in a society that identifies masculinity generally in a very limited way. And having grown up in a very conservative faith community, it's even more limited. So for those who don't know, I'm gay. I'm married to a man. I've been married now. I've been in a relationship for 16 years. And I mention that because I think it's very relevant to the conversation of what masculinity is. That
Shout out Dennis. I don't know if he's around where he can hear us.
Oh, but I say this because, in trying to find my own identity, I found that the more transparent I was, and I'll be honest with you, the first few years that I was an editor, I didn't have a picture of then my partner on my desk because I was afraid. I had this internalized homophobia that kept me from accepting myself and accepting my full potential. And when I finally started working through that, that was through a combination of meditation, exercise, talking with trusted people, it finally came to the fact that there's certain things that I can't change or don't want to change about myself, but how can I turn that into an advantage? So when I came to Tennessee 6 years ago, I wrote a column introducing my dogs, and I said, we might be run out of town. If so, we'll know that this is not the right place, but in fact, it created opportunities for more conversation and being embraced. And obviously, some people have used, my sexual orientation as a weapon. And thankfully, yeah, is that right? Yeah, and
I figured they would. I mean, I know what the world is today, and I know that anytime. That's why I called my show the Road to Redemption podcast, because my whole life is pretty much that scene from the 8 Mile movie where he just gives you everything in advance that you could use against him. And I go, okay, now you can't use it against me, because if I'm going to put it all out there in advance, because I just know that that's the culture that we live in. If you try to do anything good, people will find the one thing that they may be able to have a wayward opinion on, and they're just going to exploit that and try to discredit you completely on, even if it has no foundational belief. So I assume that was going to be a big issue for you, but the way you've overcome it and the way that you are so comfortable to be who you are is inspiring to me. I am someone who, what year was that? Do you remember what year it was when you kind of made the decision not to put a picture of your family on the desk or anything?
Yeah, well, I remember when I finally changed my mind, and that was in the mid 2000s. And it was about 2008, and having these conversations with trusted friends, and even at home, I finally was asked a question by a friend, "Why don't you have it up there, the picture?" And I said, "I don't know. Maybe it's fear." And she said, "Well, what are you afraid of?" And I said, "I don't know." I mean, it created this sense because I had to, deal with very strong personalities in the past. I was very used to being on stage, and I realized it was my own, self-discrimination that said there's something wrong here, and I had to get over it. And it takes time because it's not like it's like snap, you're there. You have to take the first step by, for example, putting a picture up, which is more symbolic than anything. But it's that first step, to your point of your show, of coming to redemption, where you say, this is important, and this will lead to the next step, and this will lead to the next step, and so on and so on. And it feels good. It feels very freeing because, to your point of the 8 Mile analogy is great, because then you're like, this is who I am, and I'm not here to cause anyone unnecessary harm, but I'm here to do what I have to do. And I'll be okay with you. You're okay with me. And it's allowed me to gain access into many conversations. I had a situation a few years ago where I was invited to speak. I think this may have been 2 or 3 years ago, at a kind of a benefactor's home in Brentwood. And every high-ranking member of the Republican Party was there of the state of Tennessee. And then here's me coming in. I'm like, oh boy. And and I just took a breath and said, look, I've been invited to make some remarks. I'm not going to insult my hosts. I'm going to do my best, and I'll be nice. And it ended up being a great evening. I had wonderful conversations.
I come from the Midwest. I'm from Columbus, Ohio. So I had friends my entire life that were gay. It was nothing ever. My sister was in theater. I loved theater my whole life. And why I connect to your story about being a man is because I constantly compared myself to what my family thought a man was. A Division I all-state quarterback who was nothing but football all the time. Well, I'm 100 pounds soaking wet, and I like Jim Carrey and Adam Sandler, and being entertaining and stuff is my thing, and so I constantly, like you, it sounds like, grew up with this thing that I was automatically starting from 3 levels behind on what a man was supposed to be. And I think you can relate that makes it tough. It makes it very tough to form any kind of life, any kind of plan for your life, because you can kind of know what you want to do for a job, but if you don't even know who you are, well, you can't even be the best version of that, So it's not until you can truly come into yourself and just look into every room you're in and go, hey, everybody here knows who I am. They know everything that they can expect here, and I'm good with that. So as long as they're good with that, I can't really worry about it.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you hit that point home, and it's very liberating. And I'm wondering, was that your concept of masculinity? Was that the reason why you joined the military?
Oh my gosh. The concept of masculinity was actually, I think me joining the military would have been defiance. My father, of all people, hates any of that stuff. He was very anti me joining. He is pretty liberal in his beliefs. So he's not a gun guy at all. So every part of that was, shockingly enough, for someone that wanted me to play sports and be this very kind of macho guy, he was never about like trying to act like you were some Billy badass or anything like that. He just was very anti all that. So when I became a military police officer, I became more of what he hated. Weirdly enough, because it's the exact opposite. It wasn't theater, and it wasn't trying to be a comedian, and it wasn't trying to play in a band or anything. It was weird. So I struggled a lot. And that's where my story comes in, because once I deployed and I was a corrections guard over in Guantanamo Bay, I thought that that's where my life was going to come to life. My parents would respect me. People would finally see me as an accomplished, respected man. And I came home, and my brothers and sisters in arms didn't respect me because it wasn't a combat deployment. I had a severe drinking problem. I was going through a divorce at the time from my first wife and having a child. So I had all these issues that I was dealing with mentally from not only my childhood, but now I had PTSD and depression and anxiety tacked on top of it, and substance abuses. And I had no idea who I was. I didn't know what I was okay with even presenting myself as. I was just a chameleon my whole life. So if I was going to talk to you, I would be one way. And then when I would go and talk to my family, I'd be the completely opposite, because I wanted to make sure that you left the experience liking me, no matter what. And I would really play to anything. And I think that's why things like Civility Tennessee, and I'm again so grateful that you're doing that. It gives people a platform to be themselves. this is what I think. When I joined the group, it asked me three simple questions. Like, do you agree to allow people to speak their minds and be responsible, be respectful, and listen in here? And that meant so much to me, because there's not many places in today's day and age where someone can honestly go to just be heard. Just, this is what I think.
Thanks so much for sharing your story, and also for your words at the end. We envisioned the Civility Tennessee group as a laboratory. I mean, there's a reason it's a closed group and not a public group, because I have a lot of experience in the commenting space and in the social media space.
Yeah.
I've been there 15 years, and it can get so ugly. And I said, I don't want trolls. I mean, this is going to destroy the whole concept. We need to give people some sense of safety where they feel that if somebody is abusive, like we had like the first, I don't know, maybe the first few months of the campaign in 2018, somebody was so angry about an issue that he went on an F-bomb rant. And I ended up having to coax him to leave. And I sent a message just apologizing to the group saying, we're going to do a better job of moderating this. And we just, stick with us. And they did. And, 3 years later, I never expected this to last beyond the first year. 3 years later, we've grown the group. And a lot of my doubts, I think, came more from just the nastiness in politics, to an earlier point that we made, that people are so unwilling to see each other as human. Yeah. that they would rather cut each other down. And I found that there were actually other people who really wanted to do better. And there were people who, when it was easier to travel around outside the house, where I would go to their events and meet them in person. And one particular individual, Marcel Hernandez, who was one of my guests on a show a couple of years ago, he was working with the juvenile justice system, and I was observing him. He invited me to observe him giving a class. And it's a tough job, because these kids in the class, they do not want to be there. They're required to be there as part of the terms of whatever punishment they have. And he really was trying to teach them. It was a group of men, young men, teach them to be better men and more mindful men. And that's tough, especially when you have a room that's forced to be there.
I have a theory that a lot of the communication issue, substance abuse issues, and mental health issues that we have in the world today come from either fatherlessness or severe issues with the relationship between children and their fathers in a lot of America. And I always ask people that I talk to, I have 3 periods of time that I really look to, like the Industrial Revolution, right after the Vietnam War, and then right around the time that the internet came around, were 3 foundational times of severe disconnect. Now, I was born in 92, so that's from my perspective, where we took hard stances during those 3 times. And all 3 times it led to families being ripped apart. When families were ripped apart, the parents and the children began to separate, and parents were never okay. What generation has ever been pretty accepting of like their parents being cool with what their kids do? It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. So we had Vietnam vets coming home to hippie kids, and then we had them coming up in systems that was like the Industrial Revolution, where it's set for bells and to go work and all these things. So parents left the home and stopped raising their kids like they used to, and kids went off to school and things like that. And we just stopped talking as families, and it stopped being okay to accept your family for who they actually were, not try to create this appearance that you were the Joneses and you were chasing the American dream like everyone else. And it led to a severe case of mental health issues. And now we're seeing those exposed in the case that no one can speak to one another hardly.
Yeah, no, I mean, that whole notion of, the family and having support is so important. It became very clear to me. I was last year a volunteer at an elementary school, reader for a kindergartner. And many of the kids were living in homelessness. They were living with their parents in a mission, and it affected you, because I could tell the kids who didn't have someone reading to them every day. Their vocabulary was nearly non-existent, and it broke my heart, because the first thing I wanted to do was like, how can I? And their teachers are doing as best they can for what they can do, because they can't parent them. And,
Well, I
and
think it's the intimate conversation too, you know, like I wish that there was, and again, this is all hopeful thinking, but if I was able to look at my parents and go, hey, I have someone at school that I was able to talk to, and I want to be able to tell you that while I like sports, I would really like for you to support me in trying acting.
Mhm.
You know, I would, that would mean a lot to me if you wouldn't judge me and put your past stereotypes and biases and labels on me. That would mean a lot to me. Can we do that? Can we have that conversation? Like, we don't have that education going on. Yes, homelessness is a massive issue, and that's something that I'm dedicated to working towards greatly, especially with young kids. I have two daughters myself, so that always breaks my heart. But what do you think we can do? What do you honestly think we can do to start making it more acceptable to go, I'm having a bad day. I'm not having a good day. This is why, or even not have a bad day, but
Mhm.
hey, I don't feel heard here. You know, whether it's a relationship issue, a political issue, or just a casual issue. Hey, we're having this conversation and I don't feel like my genuine interests are being understood here.
Yeah, it's a tough question because people have a hard time being vulnerable.
Mm.
And especially, let's say, at the workplace. Imagine going into the workplace and you might have, some issues with mental wellness, and, there's a stigma attached to that, to, being open about it. And I have some colleagues who are open, and we have an employee resource group called Mentally Forward, which is about being open and honest about getting help, and not feeling ashamed of whether you have depression or bipolar disorder or something else, or substance abuse disorder. It's about having those conversations. And I think having those public conversations are very hard, but having more private conversations in those safe spaces is really important, just for your own sense of self-worth. I think we're kind of living in a kind of a hybrid world in many ways, where as a journalist, you have to be constantly on when you are out in public, or I feel that way myself. And so when are the recharge times, which are so important to being mentally healthy? And so finding daily meditation routine, daily conversations with people, whether it's family or friends, exercise, which is so important. And then finding a way to balance. And that's the most difficult part, because there's so much, working from home has been great in so many ways, except work-life balance has been destroyed. It's been obliterated.
Yeah, 100%.
And yeah, so I've interviewed a lot of people for my podcast who are doing homeschool, for the first time in their lives, because of the pandemic, and they're having a very tough time. And
I just started a speaking tour for upperclassmen, for juniors and seniors, where I'll be going through the Clarksville and Nashville private schools for the upperclassmen and talking to them about that, about, hey, this is a crazy year, for everybody, adults. I can't imagine what you kids are going through, because it's just been so insane. I want to bring you back. I'm sorry, I'm going to bring you back to work a little bit, because we're going to have to go through the most important topic that I think people are still actively talking about. I would be remiss if I hosted a YouTube show, as you could understand, as a podcast host, and we didn't touch on something trending with the voter fraud. What are we going to do here? Well, you are bringing such a resource, because you are a credentialed person who understands these facts, and I do not at all. So please walk me through, because I'm going to admit, when I heard mail-in ballots, my first thought, as an already admitted kind of ignorant person on politics and all, I go, well, that's not going to go well. Mail-in ballots, that just gives so much openness for funny games. Help me decipher how true that is or is not.
Yeah, one of the first things that I've done, at least in my career, I've covered elections for a long time, since the year 2000. I was in Florida, actually, during the whole Hanging Chad debacle. And I spent a lot of time with elections administrators, and spent time in their offices trying to understand, how are votes counted? How do they come in? How do we know that they'll be verified? And Florida is a place that's done mail-in ballots for many, many, many years. I mean, at least a decade, if not longer. And it was always very safe, and there was always a record. So one of the things for me that I try to tell people is, first of all, let's go back to what are the options that people have. It used to be that you'd go just election day, and then they introduced early voting, and absentee balloting has been around, but for very rare cases. But then mail-in, we know, the data shows us over the last few years, there were just a few states that were exclusively doing it. Like Oregon exclusively was doing mail-in ballots, and they were not only having record turnout, but they were also having less fraud or less incidents of errors than other states were. And that's because you had that paper ballot and people could verify. So you can track where your ballot goes to and whether or not it's received.
Was there any validity to fake ballots going out? I saw it might have been a bait, a clickbait article, but it's something that I think a lot of people saw, where there were these fake pre-filled out ballots that somebody had taken a picture of and that started circulating. Do you know of any validity to any of that?
I'm not aware of anything from an official elections administrator. It's possible that some bad actor might have sent those, and that's happened before. You've had people who have abused their position. The Heritage Foundation tracks, it's a conservative group, it tracks voter fraud, and they've documented over the last several decades about 1,300 cases of verified voter fraud, which is very small in the grand scheme of things. Like in Tennessee, for example, there have been only 10 cases in the last 20 years that have been documented, at least according to Heritage. So it's a very small incident where people are doing it. It doesn't mean that people don't try to do something, but for the most part, we have found with audit after audit after audit that the system works because it's so local. On the one hand, there was a lot of talk about Dominion and its systems, but I can only speak for Tennessee because I'm not as familiar with Michigan's system. This is where a lot of the issues happened. But for example, in Tennessee, the voting machines are not hooked up to any server, so there's no way they could be hacked. So they're independent, and that's so important because you don't want anyone messing with your vote. And it does take a lot of thoughtfulness in a sense for a voter. I mean, it's easy to go through, but you definitely want to make sure that you didn't accidentally, hit this candidate when you wanted that candidate. You really want to make sure that the ballot, what's on your paper ballot, jives with what's on the screen. And then now you have that record. So my concern right now of people bringing up fraud is that court after court after court has said, where's the proof? Where's the beef?
Yeah, there's none.
Nothing there. And there certainly may be cases where, some isolated incidents where there've been some bad behavior, but, this election and the electors yesterday, they certified the election. The election.
Yeah, it was in.
Yeah, it's in.
So I remember back in 2012, I believe it was the 2012 election. And I'm actually using you to help me remember parts of my own life because I want you to tell me if I'm correct in this. I was on active duty orders. Were there some ballots that got lost at one point or not counted for active duty service members? I heard the veteran community stirring about a 2012 incident. Was there anything that you have knowledge of in there?
I'll have to look that up again, and I'm really happy to get back to you afterwards. There certainly have been concerns about the safety of the ballots for veterans, because two of the big concerns that have come through that I've heard and that I've reported on, one of them is that oftentimes veterans ballots come after election day because of the rate of mail. And so there's the threat that they're not going to be counted. So that's where that may have come from.
That may be what they're stirring.
Yeah. So but that's been a persistent issue, not just one particular election year. But the other thing is that some states do allow for veterans, if you're overseas, to vote electronically. Yeah. And there's a lot of concern about, well, should we allow everybody to vote, by the internet? And there is some severe concerns of, being hacked. We just saw the federal government was hacked this week, several agencies. And, it's best to be in a situation where you have some level of controls where, back in Florida, the whole hanging Chad debacle was one where it was the Gore versus Bush campaign that President Bush won, but it was by such a small margin. I mean, by 537, something like that, votes, and it hurts. If you lose by that little of amount, it hurts a lot.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. I can't relate, but I'm sure it hurts.
But like in the case of Georgia, it's a 12,000 vote difference, and so then when you put it in that context, it's a much larger margin. Percentage-wise, it's a small margin, but when it comes to mass votes, it's a lot of votes.
We see it all the time, and I think this is important. We see it in news, we see it in everything, where I know it's popular in, like, especially conservative media, to say, well, Russian bots. They specifically like to say Russian bots. But there, countries all over the world are creating accounts and pumping these news stories out to make people feel one type of way about the election. May not even be credible, but just to make you feel some type of way about it. I think personally that became more of our issue. We had more just chaos information and everyone not knowing what to believe and what,
Mhm.
because like you said, if, and my parents have confirmed this from my own, life, that mail-in ballots have happened like forever. I mean, we've done that. That's not a new thing that we've done. It's just something that for once somebody was able to write an article and go, well, what if this all goes to
Mhm.
crap in a handbasket? And because it's 2020, we were all like, yeah, what if it all goes to crap? And we gave that more attention than just focusing on the issues at hand, I feel.
Well, it was really interesting, the Supreme Court ruling from last week, because the issue was one that hasn't really been tested to my knowledge, which is, can an executive in a state change the election rules? So can you, for example, extend the amount of time that you accept mail-in ballots? Can you extend certain deadlines? And obviously the excuse was the pandemic, and so the states that were targeted included, I believe, was Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Georgia, and never got to the Supreme Court because they said, Texas, you have no standing. You can't sue another state for something that they can do their own process. But it would be interesting in future writings to see whether or not states re-examine what legislation will they pass next year to tidy up some of those problems. But this was such an odd year. I mean, even in Tennessee, back in June, a local judge ruled that you have to have 14. There are 14 excuses in order to vote by mail in Tennessee. So we are not a no excuse state. And a local judge said, well, throw those excuses out the window because of COVID. And she was overruled by the Supreme Court of the state back in August, who said, you can't do that, but we're going to make some little carve out exceptions to say that if under the sickness and caregiver excuses, COVID could be a valid reason for why you would vote absentee. Well, I could be California and say, hey, you're not judge, we're activist judge. I'm going to kind of, contest that. And, I'm going to, anybody who voted that way, their votes get thrown out. And so that's where it's become a little bit crazy, because we're going to have a lot of conversations about our system and, what to do if we come up with other security issues. Because I know, I have to say, I give so much kudos to poll workers who, were risking their life and safety just to make sure that people could vote, and they were dedicated.
I'll tell you, we voted in person here in Clarksville, and this was the first year that I was very grateful for those poll workers, where I was conscious of it, where when I walked in, I felt all that tension.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of, I trained MMA for a while. So you kind of know that feeling when something's about to kick off somewhere, where you're like, something, just tensions are rising here. And for them to sit in that pocket all day long and sit at those polls, that truly is amazing.
Absolutely.
Are you following what's going on right now with, I know the United States is looking to pass a bill to take cannabis off the substance one controlled substance list.
Mm-hmm.
And also there's a lot of debacle with that. And why are they not focusing on the new stimulus thing? Are you following this at all?
I have, yeah. The U.S. House of Representatives passed that bill recently. It doesn't appear that it's going to go anywhere in the Senate,
Right.
but it's been part of a trend that's been growing for over a decade to legalize cannabis in some way, whether for medicinal purposes or for recreational purposes. This discussion has been had in Tennessee for the last several years, and it almost went far this year. But then the pandemic stopped things, and the legislator who had sponsored it, Steve Dickerson, the state senator, he was defeated for election. So the question is, will it come back? But one of the interesting things is that so about 10 years ago, no, I'm sorry, it's a little over 10 years ago, the drug czar in a report basically said definitively that marijuana is not a gateway drug. It changed everything that we've been hearing about marijuana for some 40, 50 years, but it wasn't highly publicized.
Right.
I wrote about it back then. And at the time, I was writing a piece from Denver, Colorado. I was visiting Denver, and they had just started their dispensaries. This is
I was
pre-recreational.
gonna say,
This is
good place to
medicinal.
touch on the topic.
Yeah, but it was really interesting because they were able to get, it wasn't just marijuana cigarettes, but they had food, they had gourmet edibles, all this other stuff, and
Culture.
yeah, exactly. And I think the conversation needs to expand because we've been seeing typically stereotypically conservative politicians change their views. Beth Harwell, the former Speaker of the House of Tennessee, ran on a pro-marijuana agenda, a pro-medicinal marijuana agenda in 2018 for governor. And there are more and more folks, gentleman who's the head of the Republican caucus, Jeremy Faison, he is a very, he actually wants to go even further than medicinal. I mean, he sees tremendous amounts of benefits and also sees the need and obviously alcohol is pretty dangerous. I mean, and so the question is one of those things of what do you do and what kind of choice do you give people?
When we're seeing, I can only speak from a normal everyday person, but I'm seeing numbers are rising with alcohol use, suicide rates, mental health disorders during this pandemic are skyrocketing. And that's why I wanted to ask about it, because I don't even understand, as a cannabis advocate, I don't understand the legalities of it and it may just be because of my scholastic career, but can you explain more? Why is it not very hopeful that it'll do anything in the state? Like what seems to be holding that up?
It's more, we have a prohibitionist type of mentality, at least in Tennessee, and to a degree in the Senate. For the longest time, do you may recall from your studies that President Richard Nixon started the war on drugs, what was called the war on drugs in the late 60s, early 70s, and it created this very punitive approach that was made even worse in the 80s. And there was a lot of talk this year about the crime bill of the mid 90s that Joe Biden had helped get through when he was a senator, that basically punished nonviolent offenders for having some marijuana, which is absurd. In my opinion, it's absolutely absurd. If you're not someone who is a danger to society, that you should be put in prison and lose your livelihood and lose your family. And so I think we're having kind of a reckoning of sorts, where advocates are starting to see this is wrong. People, former prosecutors, former judges, and my hope is that we'll start with that aspect of saying nonviolent people don't need to be in prison, and we need to find ways to help people, have a good quality of life and good family quality of life. To your earlier point about keeping families together, and then the prohibitionist aspect has a long history in Tennessee. So prohibition. Tennessee used to be the number 1 horse racing state in the nation prior to Kentucky.
Sense. Oh, wow. Well, I was thinking Kentucky Derby. Yeah.
Yeah. So before, this was like before prohibition passed in the early 20th century, Tennessee had a horse sired all these different descendants of successful horses in Kentucky and in England. And the Belmead Plantation has a great tour that talks about the horse history. But my point is, once prohibition passed, it killed that industry. Gambling killed, and the remnants of prohibition, even after it was repealed, stayed in the state because the states could decide to limit. And it wasn't only, I think it was in the late 60s, early 70s, where liquor by the drink was allowed in a place like Nashville. You couldn't buy a drink, you couldn't buy a beer, at a bar.
That's so crazy, especially what Nashville is now.
And if you recall, in Tennessee, it's only been a few years that people have been able to buy wine in a grocery store or go to a liquor store on a Sunday.
I've only been here for about 5 years, but I lived in Ohio, and actually where I lived in Ohio for a while was right by Indiana, and they were a dry everything. You couldn't do anything there. So I have a little experience.
Well, it's funny. They a few years ago began allowing beer sales in the morning because of tailgating for the Tennessee Titans, and so
to improve sales.
and sometimes these things help, And what have we seen this year? For better or for worse, the one area where sale tax is skyrocketing is alcohol sales here in Tennessee. To your point, you are absolutely right. And I've interviewed a series of doctors and specialists who have been documenting the rise of overdoses. It is worse than it's ever been. suicides, the issue of mental health, and especially in children where it's harder to gauge.
So hard.
Yeah, and issues of domestic abuse and child abuse, and these are things that are they're being covered, but not to the extent that COVID-19 health crisis has been covered.
One thing I can tell you from experience and being in the military, and we fill out more surveys than anything. I haven't been in over 2 years, but I still get surveys every week going, will you fill this out and tell us what your substance abuse is like, what your mood is like? And I can tell you whatever the stats are, there's probably at least, and I'm throwing out a completely random stat here, but 10 to 20% inflation higher than that of people that won't admit to the problems that they're facing. And that's just from someone who has dealt with substance abuse, has dealt with mental health abuse. And I know because people have asked me, have you thought about, this week? And you go, no, because you just don't want to answer the question. And what really upsets me with it all is, I had 3 DUIs up until my last one was in 2016 from alcohol abuse, but I spent very little time in jail. Where someone who's caught with, a small, what would be seen as a medicinal use dosage amount of cannabis is still serving jail time and has been for years. And then now all this research is coming out for people that's one showing that it may even be able to help the economy bounce back from some of this stuff that's going on. But the benefits of it, I have some what I call survivor's guilt of it, because I'm like, I feel like I should be in more trouble for what I did. And there's people serving time for something that actually has a use, where alcohol, outside of your people that want to talk about the benefits of having one glass of red wine in the evening, there's not many benefits to that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I've also done a lot of work with regards to the opioid epidemic that we have. And, it's affected everybody. In Tennessee is one of the ground zero places for overdoses and for deaths, unfortunately. And one of the issues that we have there is that it takes a lot longer to recover than there's money in insurance to get you the help that you need. Sure. And so we have too many people who are, because they can't afford the opioids, going to heroin or some other illicit drug, and it's just a vicious cycle. I just watched the movie Hillbilly Elegy that just came out on Netflix, and it was really interesting because it deals with that, with generational poverty and generational addiction and abuse.
It's Hillbilly Elegy?
Hillbilly Elegy. So it's from a book called J.D. Vance, and he wrote it a few years ago. He grew up in Ohio and kind of Rust Belt area, and his own family, they're from Appalachia, with Appalachian roots, went to the city to go get a job. And, the economy, as we know, in places like Ohio and Pennsylvania, just, was decimated, not too long ago. And these families that, they struggle.
I have to ask you before we get out of here, as we wrap this up, because most know, and some will even find this odd, politics is something that I always steered away from because I didn't understand it. I was afraid of it. I was afraid to give my mark because I was afraid that people would see me as not uninformed, but they would see me as someone trying to be malicious, when all I wanted to do was find out. And that's why I had you on the show, because I felt like you would be a good person to talk to and bring it all in well-rounded. But I have to ask, I heard you talk about Miss Wade, your 6th grade school teacher, and your mother being your 2 main sources of why you got into politics. Why do you think this has really been the calling of your life, to talk politics, but more than that, be the front runner in talking politics in a communal setting?
Yeah, I think I was encouraged back in elementary school to get into this book about the presidents, and it just got me very excited. And I love to read. I love biographies. I remember my first biography was about Franklin Roosevelt, the 32nd president, and I just voraciously read all these books and other texts that I could find. And I had thought at one point of getting into a political career because I was thinking about being a lawyer. But after a while, I said, I prefer being a writer. I want to be active in helping people understand this world. And so that requires a lot of relationships, with professional relationships with politicians and also with the community. And one of the big lessons that I love to give is that I am most excited about local politics, about those politics that come at your city council level or school board level, because they have so much of a greater impact on your daily life. And I encourage people to attend their board meetings. Now many of them are virtual, but you can, watch them. You can contact your city council member, who's usually a member of your society. It could be at the grocery store while you're shopping there if you go. And it's really, this is what makes our democracy work, is this series of decisions and choices and compromises, so that we can get to hopefully a better space. How do we want to invest in our schools? How do we want to invest in our sidewalks? What is the right amount of law enforcement to have? What is the right regulatory structure that we have when it comes to things like cannabis in states like Colorado and Washington, or alcohol here in the state of Tennessee? And it even goes from a simple perspective. It's going to sound trite, but scooters and pedal taverns are all part of that landscape when it comes to understanding local politics, because they bring in money, but at the same time they can be a nuisance.
Yeah, on a lighter note, those scooters are wild. I went down. I don't spend a lot of time in Nashville. I've only gone down there 2 or 3 times since I've lived here in Clarksville. But the last time I went down there, I was literally just took my camera at like 5:30 one morning and wanted to go shoot pictures of Nashville before it's filled up. And those scooters were everywhere. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're everywhere. They're laying. It literally looked like a bunch of people just like were a part of the rapture and just disappeared, and a scooter fell over. And I was like, I called my wife even and was like, they let them do this? They let people just drop them? And then they explained that there's like a whole hustle in it. There's people that drive around in vans and pick them up and charge them, and they like con people out of money or something. I don't know what's going on with it. But
well, there's a business model around it, and it was even more, even a much more present situation a few years ago, because Nashville has become a little bit harder on scooters. So, but at one point there were 7 companies that were operating in Nashville, and yeah, they'd be all over the place. And I saw a lot of promise in scooters, and I still do, as long as they're used responsibly, like throwing them on the sidewalk where you can block somebody. I've got a staff member of mine who's blind, and so I often think about him and what would happen if he were walking and tripped over one of them. He could really hurt himself very badly. And on the other hand, if it's used properly, I remember I had my car in the shop, maybe it was last year, and I decided I was going to take the bus to work, and I would take the scooter from my house to the bus stop so that I wouldn't be all sweaty, by the time I got to the bus. So
can people still get a DUI in the city of Nashville for driving intoxicated on a scooter?
I would presume so, because it's a vehicle, but I don't recall hearing about a case like that in some time.
In Indiana, the reason I ask is I got my second DUI was in Indiana, and the loophole was when you got a DUI in Indiana, just get a scooter because they don't count that as a vehicle. So you would literally have people in Indiana just driving down the road drinking a beer on a scooter because they could. So that's where I was like, is that why this is happening? Is this where all the shenanigans are coming from? Because people are riding around tanked on scooters and they just get drunk, drop it off, and don't care. So
no, you know what's tough though is the first scooter death that occurred was from someone who was drunk and turned into the wrong way of a street. Oh. It was a very preventable death. On a lighter note, I mean, I see the tremendous benefits, because if you're a tourist, if you're visiting, you don't want to walk block after block, and it makes it easier, and it's not very expensive.
Nashville's got a lot of this too.
It does.
It doesn't look like it. If you're driving into the city, you wouldn't so much feel like, oh, this is going to be a hike here if I'm trying to get from the Johnny Cash Museum over to like Nissan Stadium, but you'll get a workout. You'll get them legs pumping if you take a quick stroll down there.
Well, when I first run from my house to downtown, I don't live too far from downtown. I got there, and because of the hills, I lived in Florida for so long, which is flat. And so I wasn't used to all those hills, and I was out of breath after 2.5 miles. And I was able to get a beast cycle, which is kind of one of those shared bicycle, and took it back home, because otherwise I would have been like laying down on the floor.
That's amazing. All right, David, I want to ask you one more question before we get out of here. Something you touched on, and I think it's important. Right? One serious thing, one lighthearted thing before we get out of here. How do we get back to respecting the rule of law?
Yeah, I think one of the things is, first of all, to understand it. And like you are doing today, asking questions about what is the law and is it just? And, you know, if we don't like a particular law, to advocate for its repeal, but also to follow the law, you know, and I think a lot of it is just more of an understanding. And right now we have, like, one of the best comparisons that I have at this moment is mask mandates. Not every county has one. I mean, the governor allows counties that don't have a health department to mandate them. And, you know, we have a choice. You know, there are certain penalties in Nashville, at least, if you violate it, but it's not very much, it's not as enforced as perhaps it could be.
Sure.
Should that be the best use of law enforcement time, to have to chase after everyone who doesn't wear a mask? Or can a citizen decide, I'm going to do the right thing, much like I make the decision if I see a piece of trash to pick it up from the ground and put it in the trash can. I think respecting the rule of law is about acting like a good citizen and saying we have laws for a reason. And sometimes there are bad laws and we have to work on those, but we're society. And if we don't follow that, then we become susceptible to corruption. My biggest concern with all the rumors and innuendo about voter fraud is that it starts to take away from our system. Suddenly we don't trust the people who are executing a law, be it a governor or secretary of state. And that's not healthy. You know, there's a system and there's a process, and we need to say that sometimes we win, sometimes we lose when it comes to these processes, but it's important to support them.
I don't know if you have noticed this at all, but to the people that I have associated with over the last year, what you said there at the very end was so fundamental for me, because I felt like the system that we've always known was almost uncertain. We didn't know that after this year, whether, at least I felt like I didn't know if the American way of life that we've known it was going to continue, but in the same regard, I don't know if it should either. Like, we know that there's so many problems, and yes, we're the greatest country in the world, but that doesn't mean that we don't have massive issues that we need to fix. And I was starting to get this feeling at the beginning of the pandemic, early into it, that will we ever see normal again? And obviously, I don't want some things to ever be normal again. Like, we don't want the issues like the George Floyd situation to ever happen again, ever, ever, ever again. So those need to radically change. So the system that we live in needs to radically change. But what about the things that make us safe? You know, what about our freedoms and our ability to speak freely and ask these questions to people who know better? And that's where I really got scared. I was genuinely afraid for a while that we may lose some of what makes America truly great. Do you think we're at risk for that? Do you think that's even possible?
Well, I think we're certainly at risk every time someone decides not to respect our laws and our rules. When we decide that we're a lawless society, to your initial question, and that's why we have to hold our elected officials accountable to respecting the system that we have. Because I agree with you, I don't want to return to the normal as usual. You know, I want to be able to come in with this much more. You know, one of the best things that happened this past year, imagine this: who would have thought that in less than a year, not just one but two vaccines would be created for a new virus that was up to this point killing so many people here in this country.
Yeah.
And this is just a wonderful piece of news, in spite of all the tragedy that we're seeing. You know, more than 300,000 people who've died here in the States. And I think that you know, our system has proven that it is extremely strong. Yes. We've had moments in history where we have not abided by it. If we look back in the civil rights era, where people's rights were being abused extrajudicially, and we had people like General Dwight Eisenhower, then President Eisenhower, come in and say, we are going to desegregate these schools. And that also came at a cost. So we're going to constantly have this tension, because when people are at the heart of making decisions in democracy, we're going to have those tensions that somebody's going to want to go in one direction or in the other. What I think is important is to say, if we create a common respect for, let's say, our institutions like the Senate, the House of Representatives. There's a funny poll, a disconnect that I've seen when I've done my research. That is, people have a very low opinion of Congress, but they tend to have a very high opinion of their own member of Congress, which is why so many of them get elected again and again and again. There are very few incumbents who lose if they choose to run. And in part, it's because they have created a relationship with their community where they're providing services, they're being responsive. And in a sense, some of them are saying, yeah, it's the other guy, it's not me. That's why we're having problems. That's why the wheels are moving. And we need more collaboration, I think, at that level.
And on that alone, I could talk to you about that for 2 hours, because I think the biggest disconnect in life comes from when people, well, I just said it, feel disconnected. For me, as a young man growing up in Columbus, Ohio, the Senate, the House, the Congress, those were just words. That didn't mean anything to me. It didn't, yes, we learned about it in history class, but those weren't people. Those weren't people that I knew. They weren't talking about anything that I could relate to. Or if they were, I wasn't even understanding, hey, that's your senator. That's what they do. This is what they can do for you, and this is why you should know who they are. So until you become 18, 19, 20, when you can start, when you actually start getting some political ideas of your own, then you go, I should probably learn about that person. I should know what's going on in that regard.
I mean, too often people don't take the time to know. I mean, sometimes they're busy, but it's important because one of the biggest services that our state lawmakers did for their constituents this past year is help them with the unemployment system in Tennessee. And we documented numerous cases of people who were fielding hundreds of calls just trying to help people get their benefits because they had lost their job and they were feeling hopeless. And that was so fundamental. I mean, I think despite the issues that we've seen over the last year, when it mattered, people tended to come together for the most part. And I mean, the tornadoes of March, that was a great example of that too.
Yes, that was massive. That absolutely was massive. Okay, last one, the lighthearted one, the easy one, the one you should be able to knock out of the park super easy. What have you and your family? I know you got the dogs, Zoe and Bandit, right? Are the names of the two dogs? What have you guys been doing to stay happy, healthy, connected? What are you guys doing? Do you have something in place where you set in, okay, we are going to talk at this time every night to make sure that we stay locked in? Because I know for myself, working from home, it's just become my office. My living room is my office. So now when I'm in my living room, I'm still working and I'm not connecting as much. What are you guys doing?
Yeah, I mean, we had some hard conversations at the beginning in March because my husband is an interior designer and his business was disrupted completely. And so the first thing we decided, because we had gone through the Great Recession and we got our butts kicked there, but we learned a lot. We came out of it much stronger. And we applied the lessons that we learned there, which is number one, let's not blame each other. Let's not turn on each other. And every time we feel frustrated, let's take a walk or let's have a talk. And then, we also created some natural barriers. So I have rooms in the house where when I'm working, I might be in the kitchen or I might be upstairs. And it's not because I don't want to be with him. It's just, it's important to have a little bit of space.
You gotta lock in. Yeah.
You got to lock in. And then also to make sure that there's time where you're spending, quality moments together, like dinner. I really got into cooking during this pandemic. And it's
I started a whole YouTube cooking show.
Did you?
Yeah.
Well, we got into HelloFresh and we're not doing that anymore, but we are still cooking quite a bit. And it's just, I found it cathartic because I would put my phone down. It forced me to say, I need to concentrate on this. And it was wonderful because then we would have a conversation. I love working out. I love swimming and running. And then I have some weights where I do work out in in my guest room. That's been very healthy too. And then, we have some friends who we have social bubbled with where we're extremely careful. It's very limited. We'll sometimes watch movies together and at homes, not at the movie theater.
Sure.
And we took a trip to see my family, my parents, back in September. And that was really healthy because it was wonderful. We got tested for COVID beforehand. We social bubbled, and by the time we left, nobody was sick. By the time we left, it was wonderful, and it was probably one of my fondest memories, despite the hardship of 2020.
Mhm.
Probably the best thing about this year has been connecting with people in my family that I haven't connected with in a very deep way. My siblings, I might have talked to them every few months. We are communicating every several days, and we have a rhythm, and it's been great. And so that old normal, I hope never comes back. I hope that after this we can stay connected like that, because it was essential to our survival.
I hope so too. And I hope you and I can stay connected. I hope after all this is over, maybe we can film a cooking show together and we'll do another podcast.
Let's do
Uh,
it.
David, tell people, I heard so many of your content, your pieces of content via YouTube on the Tennesean. Your story is out there, your personal story. I haven't seen the TEDx Nashville speech hit YouTube yet. Do you know when the followers can expect to be able to find that?
Yeah, they're in the midst of doing their Perception 2020 event right now. So
Okay.
shortly after this, they're going to start uploading it. So I suspect it's going to be right after the new year.
Yeah, I'm tuning in tonight at 7:30. Are you going to be on there?
I will be. I'll be hosting one of the speeches. So
Oh,
I'll be
great.
there asking with
Well,
the
great. I'll
first
see
with
you
the first
there
speaker.
then. Please, before we get out of here, don't let me forget. Please, please, please tell everyone where they can find you. Tell everyone where they can find your most up-to-date content, all the things you're currently working on. Plug it all.
Yeah, sure. I mean, people, if you want to email me, dplazas, DPLAZAS at Tennesean.com. Tennesean.com is our website. You can find me on the opinion page. We have a dedicated Civility Tennessee page there. You can find me on Facebook, just David Plazas, and you can find Civility Tennessee there. LinkedIn, same thing. And Twitter. I've made it very easy. It's just my name. And then
Yes.
Instagram, though, is DE Plaza. So that's the only thing that's a little bit different.
Well, in my opinion, you're the best article writer, storyteller, speaker that we have to offer here in Tennessee, and I appreciate your time very, very
Well,
much.
I'm so honored to be with you, and thank you for giving me this opportunity and for doing such great research. And I'm really honored. I think you know more about me than most people do.
Well, thank you so much. And like I said, we're going to wrap it up here. We'll say done, and then you and I can say our goodbyes off air.
All right, sounds good.